Hello, I'm Storm Knight with the HSG Group. And anyway, it is my pleasure to present Fred Moore. He is the current CEO and president of Horison Information Strategies. He's been with storage tech before that for 21 years. And so he is an expert in the field. And most of the time he gives many presentations about this subject matter, so it should be a pretty lively presentation. And anyway, I will go ahead and leave it over to Fred. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Storm. Always a pleasure to be here. I think for me this is about a 40-year journey to get here, because when I got out of graduate school at the University of Missouri, I loved the mountains. I was going to be an atmospheric science major and get a PhD in atmospheric science, and I wanted to work here. And I was telling Storm, when I got out of graduate school, I interviewed with NCAR. I was so excited, and they said, no deal. You don't have any work experience. We can't hire you without 3 years of work experience on top of your degree. So that was the end of that, but I wound up out here pretty quickly after that with storage tech. And basically I spent my entire career deep in the storage industry. So this is all I got for you is data storage. But we're going to take a trip through this industry and talk about a lot of things going on. Fortunately, I do have the time to track it every day. So this helps me see what's going on. I hope it's informative. All the questions you have, lay them on. I'm waiting to hear what's on everybody's mind. But we are going to talk about the rise of secondary storage. And there's a big reason that secondary storage is so popular now. We're going to talk about that. It's really the hottest single storage infrastructure topic that we have. But we're in the zettabyte era right now. The zettabyte era, it means that there's more than a zettabyte of data created each year. And we hit that mark around 2016, somewhere in there. And at the current growth rate of 27.5%, by the way, it's a lot lower this year for storage, first time in 23 years. But it's going to take probably 2043 or so to get to the next era of storage, the yottabyte era. So here we go. And some of the things that, just give you an idea, you guys probably know this pretty well, but a lot of the things that equal a zettabyte, an entire Netflix catalog, you watch it and transfer it, put it on stream it 3 million times. I mean, I can't find one show on Netflix I like anymore, so I'm not contributing to that much, but the world is, and it's a different story when you look at it like that. Enough to record a video call that's more than 237 million years long. Now, who can talk that much, right? But I guess that's a possibility. And you can look around at some of the other things up here. In the upper right-hand corner, you'll notice that in terms of storage, a zettabyte is 55 million LTO9 cartridges non-compressed. So think about where that would go. 59 million cartridges. You'd start here and you'd wind up in Firestone, right? Over Storm's house, probably. 50 million 20 terabyte HDDs, 250 billion DVDs, on it goes. But the zettabyte era is a big deal right here. It's accelerated because of this, and this is what's really taken a big stand right now. How many months does it take to get 100 million users on these things? Started off with LinkedIn, 7 years and 11 months to reach 100 million, and here we go. At the end of last year and through January, it took 2 months for ChatGPT to get 100 million users. And the thing is, each one of these applications generates data. Every time you hit, swipe left, swipe right, tag something, you're generating data. And it goes somewhere. A lot of it is not stored. A lot of the data generated is never stored. But the net is, these are major impacts on the amount of data that has to be stored somewhere in our world. So that's keeping things pretty interesting. I'm going to use a couple of different numbers here. I use both IDC and Trend Focus. I do a lot of work with Trend Focus, but if it says 8, 9, 10, 11 zettabytes, do we really know the difference? Those are best estimates, so don't get too hung up on the numbers on that. But that's kind of what's going on there. By 2025, we're going to store somewhere between 8 and 11 zettabytes of data will be permanently stored. So that's what we've got to deal with in the storage industry. That number, again, is way down this year. We'll talk about that. So what happens here is that the secondary storage world is increasing. That is not solid state disk and disk. Secondary storage are lower activity, more archival, darker data type things. Lots of big archives of data that are kept that aren't used for a long time. 80% of the activity in data roughly goes to 20% of the actual space. And this 80-20 rule has been part of the DNA of the storage industry since it started. 80-20 applies to so many different things here. But I want you to look at just an overview of what's going on in secondary storage. If we throw out all the junk data that we can't really account for, it looks like by 2025 we'll have about 8.4 zettabytes of data that needs to be stored in all the data centers around the world. 80% of that data is archival. It's low activity. It's not used enough to economically warrant its presence on rotating disk. So that is a challenge there. Over 80% of all that data created is basically some kind of unstructured data. No tags, no indices, hard to find it. It needs help to be located, and on it goes. One big thing for the storage industry that it's amazing it's slipped through the cracks this long, but the archival data is seldom backed up. So if your archives have any value, and for most customers, not all, but most, there's one copy. If it's gone, your archive is done. And I was out at the Library of Congress about 2 months ago, and they're faced with this huge issue. The Library of Congress, they archive all the world's valuable archives, whatever they may be. They're digitizing all this. They got to store it. And where's your backup? It's not in the same building. It's not in the same state. For data that valuable, it better be geographically distant in several locations. So the new wave of storage demand could come from just another copy of the archived data. And if it's 80% of the data, think how much more storage that's going to take. So you have to be a little more selective about how you do that, how you back it up. And we're going to talk about a few ways to do that. A lot of data is kept over 100 years now. We're never going to get rid of all the movies that are made, all the Super Bowl videos. They're going to last forever. Nobody's going to delete the Super Bowl. In fact, around here, nobody's ever going to get in the Super Bowl, so we don't have to worry about that one very much. But all these are permanent archives. All the newsreels, I go back and search those all the time now to find what happened last week, who was in the Mideast or wherever, and what's going on there. So all this data is archival, and then it becomes active for a little bit of time. A lot of things driving up activity, AI and ML. AI, this is the year of fire for AI, right? It caught fire. It's everywhere. I get something every day about AI to deal with. It's on my phone. I ask chat, question I get all the time, and it's like, what is the future of storage? The answer was pretty good. It was pretty good. I was really shocked at what came back. And it looked like the abstract of some report I wrote, actually, but it was right on the money, and I was kind of amazed. I did a few more things with it, but we'll talk a little bit about the challenges in that area. But these things are also driving up demand. Data protection, critical. Cybercrimes all over the place. Data gets hacked right and left. What do customers do to protect their data? Tell me your strategy. I ask customers that, I think I got a call coming up here I better take. It's hard to get them to really fess up to what's going on there. So that becomes a challenge also. One of the new things we're seeing emerge right now as we sit here is the emergence of the active archive as a new sub-tier in the storage hierarchy. And this plays a lot of role of your infrastructure because different parts of the archive are active at different times. It moves around. That's the data that needs higher performance than the traditional offline tape type storage. So that's a big piece of archive now. And I think we should expect a new secondary storage deep archive tier to arrive. Notice I don't say when, because these technologies have had a rough year progressing. These are technologies that we don't talk about normally. And then the sad thing here is the race to $0 per terabyte is crippling our industry. It's good for you because you don't have to pay anything for storage, but it's killing the vendors because they don't have any revenue to invest in the future. And that slows down the roadmaps, and we have big challenges with that. So part of this game is interesting to know, and I'm not quite sure if you're in this category or not. HPC is different generally than hyperscale, but we've got about 700 hyperscale data centers right now in the world. 49% at the last count the other day are in the U.S. China's got 15. The rest are spread around like this. But the key thing is the leverage the hyperscalers have on the storage vendors. They are so big. They have so much power with the size of storage that they buy that they can say, I need 50,000 disk drives. Here's the price I'm willing to pay. Take it or leave it. And most people cave in and take the low price, drive the price down like crazy. We're going to see what that's done this year to pricing in the storage industry. I've tracked it for hundreds of years here, it seems like, and I've never seen anything like this. So that is a tremendous challenge. And many of these hyperscale let me come back. Hyperscale data centers contain over 50% of all the data stored in the world. Those data centers are enormous. Most of them are over 100,000 square feet. Just to give you an idea, the average Walmart store, the superstore, is 138,000 square feet. So they're a little smaller than that building, filled up with nothing but racks and a few blinking lights. So that's what's going on there. You see a picture of a couple of those on the right-hand side. There's the whole campus on the left. The biggest one in the world is 10.7 million square feet. It's the size of some states in New England, it seems like, but it's in China. China Telecom. Biggest one in the whole world. Average person in a hyperscale data center will support 25,000 servers. They have very, very few people working there. You know why? All they do is pull out and plug in and get out. And this is it's plug and replace strategy overall. They don't fool around with anything. They pull out a whole rack of disk, pull out a rack of servers and dump them if they're gone. They've got enough redundancy built in that they don't feel too much pain when that happens. In the hyperscale data centers, the HSDCs use about 20% of all the data center energy in the world, not the energy in the world, but that goes to data centers. Energy consumption is a huge challenge for them. Sustainability, carbon footprint. These campuses, like you see on the left, have their own sustainable energy sources often, if they can find it. Renewable energy, which is too inconsistent for most of them to live with, because they can't count on it every day. And to store it is a challenge. So a lot of new technologies here. They are pressing the limits of every bit of architecture much faster than the traditional enterprise data centers. And their demand curves are passing the capability of current disk and tape. So that means the industry needs to see things move faster. And they can do this because they're over half the industry. So they get like 10 votes to every one that the rest of us get in this conversation. So when we look at secondary storage data, the life cycle really materializes like this. On your left-hand column going up and down is the probability of access of data. And as time goes on since the last access of data, the longer it goes without being accessed, the more archival it normally becomes. There are some exceptions to that. System files, indices, catalogs are hit all the time. So they don't apply. Databases probably don't apply much to this, but everything else does. And that's probably 90% of all the data. So as you can see, as you go across the timeline on the bottom, data goes from hot to warm to cold to deep archive, and then finally dark data. The longer data goes without being accessed, the darker the data gets. Deep archived is a reference to the technology that you store it on. Dark data is a reference to how long it goes without being accessed. And you can look at the red curve going down. That's the probability of access. It declines over time for everything. From 100%, take an email. You get it, you look at it, you hit it right off the bat. It's real active. A week later, how many emails are you looking at? Now, we were looking at a few just a while ago that were a month old here. But in general, after a few days on the email, you don't use it again. So it becomes archival. And the profile factors for archival data: one, the probability of access declines as data ages. Keep that in mind. Most data typically becomes archival in 90 days to 120 days. At that point in time, it's not been used long enough to economically warrant to sit on disk and spin around, suck up energy and cooling at the same time. It should be somewhere more economical. And you can bring it back into the active archive if you want, just like a cache buffer in a disk subsystem when you need it. So that works okay, but most people don't do that. Of all the we're going to see in a minute that most of the archive data is stored in the wrong place. If you're concerned about the economics of your storage. If you got Fort Knox funding your IT operation, we'll close this up right now, but that's not the case for most people. Archival data is piling up faster than it can be analyzed. This was really true of COVID. In COVID, data was being collected. We were all filling out forms right and left. I was signing up for stuff I didn't know yet. I was having dreams about things that hadn't happened yet. Even it was so wild. How many times do I have to verify that I've had shot number 3? But all that data is there to be analyzed at some point. So it piled up, but it hasn't gone through the analytic process yet to do that. I mentioned earlier that the archive data is seldom backed up, so this is a storage opportunity that, if your archives are valuable, one copy is probably not a very good strategy. The value of data can vary over time. This week, all the COVID data that we look at in New York City is being analyzed like crazy. Okay, we're done with that, and the data Won't see it for a year. It goes archival. And then we look at all the data in Seattle and what happened during COVID during that time frame. And it's real active during that analytic period, and then it goes away. So the archival data changes over time. It's not all just dead forever, but it's got recurring use on that. And I mentioned the retention periods of 100 years or more to infinity now are common, and we know some things that go to infinity. So if you look at the left on this chart, we're going to, again, there's a few different sources for numbers, but I'm going to take 8.4 zettabytes stored in 2025. And think about that. That's what's stored. The data generated is much bigger than that. About 94% of all the data generated is never stored. It's transient. It's used during a transaction. You log off, it all goes away. You delete it at night. It's just short-term life. So permanent storage is what we're looking at here. We're going to see AI enter the mix pretty quickly here for improved storage management for all this. And if AI makes the decisions that the industry doesn't make, you would take that 8.4 zettabytes and distribute it as this pyramid on the left, or on your right, shows you. And the data that's real active with the high IOPS count is going to go up in the non-volatile memory. That is predominantly flash memory today. And that's about 10% of all the data in the world. It has enough IOPS to warrant the cost to go up there. Another 10% would sit on mission critical, high performance apps. This is primary storage again. This is the enterprise class hard disk drive business. Another 15% of that falls down into what we call active archive. So the active archive can exist either on tape, on disk, or both. So that's why that area kind of blends in between there. And disk is involved there, so we're still looking at primary storage. But in primary storage, we're looking at 35% of all the data probably in that top sector up there. And that's low-class disk, really. That's cheap SATA disk. The bit error rate's 3 orders of magnitude less than 10 to the 16th for fiber channel disk. So, it's not your enterprise class workhorse disk, but it's cheaper, and that's where less important data will go. When we fall below the line, though, we're looking at the archive, cold data. What's the primary, if we put the data in the right place, it would go on tape today because of the economics, environmental savings, total cost. Most people, when I say that, don't even know what's going on in the tape industry. I'm just stunned at how the tape industry can avoid marketing itself as much as it does. Nobody knows. I can recall sitting in my house, which is about 5 miles north of you, probably in the year 2013, when the reliability of tape exceeded that of disk. Now, I worked at Storage Tech 21 years. I got hammered on tape reliability till I could hardly walk. But guess what? The reliability of tape in 2013 got better than disk. Today, the bit error rate for tape is 1 in 10 to the 20th, 1 bit permanent failure in 10 to the 20th bits read. Dramatically over disk. And I thought, God, I'm going to get flooded with emails and calls and everything. Not one person called. Nobody knew. It's like I'm the only person in town that even knew this. How about the tape vendors that used to be here? They didn't even talk about it. But that happened. And to many people's surprise, modern tape is much more reliable than disk. Who knew? And the better question for me is, why don't they know? It's an indictment of the marketing capability of the tape companies. But anyway, we will look at that in a minute. You can see how the access times vary going up and down on the right side over there. Lower price and TCO going down, less energy consumption going down, but faster performance going up. So the key to this chart is to get the right data in the right place. And if you did that, the world's data would kind of break down like this. But that is not the way the data normally looks in the world here. And look at on the bottom. There's another category of data sitting over here of junk data. We don't even know what it is. Legacy data, unknown data, nobody's touched it. The owners have gone. Companies merged together. You pick up another data center. Whose data is this? Well, they left. I don't know. And it just sits there because people are afraid to get rid of it. And this is your junk drawer for data. I'd like to call it personally the data cemetery. Let's bury this stuff because it's just sitting around clogging up everything. It's amazing on that. So we look a little deeper into the secondary storage world here. Here's our storage hierarchy, kind of the split between 20% of the data should be in the top and 80 on the bottom. That's not the way it really is. But the key over here are the following things to look at on this. And I mentioned on your left-hand column up there several bullets on there, but the bottom bullet, the majority of the data stored is stored on the wrong tier. Most archival data still sits on disk, spinning around doing nothing for years. Put data on there, spin it for 5 years. The average lifetime of a disk drive on the floor in a data center is 5.1 years before it fails, before it's replaced for a new technology. Unbelievable. It's predominant. People don't want to fool with tape. They didn't like tape. They still remember tape from 15 years ago when you had edge, stretch, tear damage, humidity damage, whatever. You take a little piece of tape 3,900 feet long out of an LTO cartridge and try to pull it apart. I lift weights every day. I can't do it. It's that solid. Those days are over in the industry, but not in the minds of the data center people. So a big piece of work to do there. But this secondary storage now, instead of just being archived, it's going to break down like this. About 15% of the data in an archive would be active at any point in time. There are archive accelerators around here. Those would be called an active archive, where you combine a nearline disk in front of a tape library, and it serves as a buffer. If you want an instant archive, you can put flash arrays up in front of your tape library and get even faster access on that. That's less common, but disk or flash up there can be your active archive layer and serve as a buffer for the back end of that. The archive data is pretty much the domain of tape libraries today. That's the best place for most of this data. They can be scaled to petabytes and exabytes in capacity. We have a library vendor 10 miles from us that can deliver an exabyte library. And several are around the corner from doing that. I say several because we don't have too many choices. I keep that in mind. The bottom layer is the yet to emerge time capsule layer. These are technologies that aren't on the floor yet, or else they're still in the basement. I'm not sure where they are, but they haven't made it up to the first floor. But they've been trying real hard. And this is for all this data we want to keep forever. This is a time capsule. We're going to lock it away and save it. It's kind of like the seed bank off the coast of Norway. There's an island. It's got every seed of every plant in the world, every vegetable, in case there's a Holocaust or an EMP or whatever. You know, that data the plants could come back and the human population could survive. So that's all part of this time capsule world. That's what DNA was going after. That's what glass storage, holographic, and all these things were trying to go after that, because that's your long-term, that's your natural cave for everything, indestructible. And it's not here yet. But that will emerge, not nearly as quick as I would have said build down when we were in Tucson. We've had some significant slowdown in that whole thing right now. So that's kind of the game here. And again, a lot of this data is stored in the wrong place. I think we'll see in 4 to 5 years. I've got a chart on this I didn't put in yet because it's a little far out. But we'll see an optimized active archive where instead of moving data in the pyramid on your left, you know, if you want to move data from one tier to the other, you have to read it in a server and write it back out. We just did 2 extra IOs. Why do we do that? And the optimized active archive of the future will move data directly between layers, kind of like a DMA interface would do for you. You know, in a disk cache system, the cache in a disk takes data directly out of the subsystem. You don't read it off the disk and write it back into cache. Those are interconnected and tightly integrated. So we'll see a tightly integrated architecture come out of this and solve this problem. So every time you move data around up and down these pyramid tiers, that's really cool, but it takes a big cost in terms of I/O to do all that. So what we're building up to here in this whole scenario is what's called a vertical market failure. I am very concerned about this, and I wonder if anybody else is. Wow. So a vertical market failure occurs in secondary storage in our conversation here when the underlying infrastructure, that's the disk and the tape and even the solid state, doesn't improve fast enough to meet the demands of the hyperscale and cloud marketplace. And why that's important, they're over half the market. They're driving this market right now for everybody else. Their demands are exceeding this. Again, I think you'll see a 50 terabyte tape cartridge in 3 to 4 months. That'll help the tape industry a lot. The disk industry is trying to get beyond 20 terabytes on disk. They've got some challenges there. But the issue is the gap between what's available on the top and what the half the market needs on the bottom. And that's a vertical market failure. What's causing that? Why would we have this vertical market failure? Well, the risk factors are a big piece of this. The worldwide secondary storage market is becoming an exclusive domain of a few suppliers. We're all in the storage business. Some of us work for one or have worked for a storage vendor. I work for a customer vendor, and I am an analyst, so I've been on all sides of this equation. But there's only a few suppliers left. For example, in the tape industry, there is one company on the planet Earth that builds tape drives, IBM. When I was at Storage Tech, the highest number of tape drive companies I ever saw, there were 24 companies building tape drives. We had 8mm, 4mm, DAT, DLT, Quick, everything else on there, and several versions of those. And little companies all over this county, by the way, probably half of those are in Boulder County doing all this, were there. They're all gone. They're all gone right now. We have one company left with tape. So what would happen when you have a single supplier in the market? What would happen to secondary storage if you didn't have an environmentally safe technology to store stuff on? Now everything would have to go on disk. If you think global warming is heating up the planet, think what's going to happen now. So we need an energy efficient secondary storage solution to get through this. So the threat around tape, and I actually work with a guy closely in IBM Tucson, that I said, you guys can't, you got to stay in this and improve. And I think you're going to see that in a few months. Thank goodness. There's two tape media suppliers in the world, Fujifilm and Sony. Fujifilm has about 65% of the media market, Sony about 35%. The disk area, let's move up the stack a little bit in that pyramid. The disk environment has 3 companies left in the world making disk. Back in the day when I worked at Storage Tech, there were over 60 companies making HDAs. We have 3 left. Why is that? They can't make a dime. Price erosion every year from day one in storage, the price drops. So if your price of what you sell per gigabyte, terabyte, whatever the metric was at the time, drops 20% a year, if you don't sell 20% more, everybody in the room ought to know what that means. No growth. If your price erosion exceeds the growth rate, you lose money. You know, losing money is a strategy, just not a very good one. So that's a challenge. And now we don't have anybody left because of consolidation. They can't survive. They get bought out. They're gone. Again, the 3 disk suppliers, Seagate, Toshiba, Western Digital, are the only ones that remain. Another concern there. Not a lot different than tape. And with lower revenues and a slowdown, the roadmaps slow down. You don't have as much R&D to fund your future development. Typically, in a company in this world, you will spend maybe 8 to 10, 12% of your revenue on R&D to build new products and fill out that roadmap and deliver that roadmap on time. But if your revenues slow down, 10% of a lower number is less to spend, and then the development slows down. And that's how we got behind on that vertical market failure curve. We fell behind. Because people, it's like a used car business in a way. You know, you go into a used car lot anywhere around here, and what is the first thing you think about is how to lower that price. You don't even know what the price is, and you're going to lower it. You go into a hospital here, and guess what happens? You don't even ask the price. You're afraid you're going to have to file chapter right afterwards. But it's a whole different game here. And the mindset is like used cars. The storage is always too high, whatever it is. It's always wrong. And everybody wants a piece of flesh out of this game before you can move forward with it. So these are the facts. I mean, you like them or don't like them, but this is what's really going on here. And it's fueled this whole thing like that. So the hyperscale data centers then leverage their power. They drive down the prices, impacts margins, impacts R&D. Again, without a tape energy or an energy efficient technology, meaning something with removable technology that doesn't spin all the time or require much energy, VMF, won't be helped by sustainability. We'll have a high energy VMF on our way here. We have one energy efficient data center technology in the world. It is tape. Like it or don't like it, that's the way it is. The race to zero, again, I mentioned this a few times, it hurts margins, funding, and everything else. Can we mitigate this somehow? What can be done? I'm working on a committee to try to solve this. And we have a lot of hope right now in what I mentioned and alluded to for tape coming up. The disk vendors are trying to do some things, which I'll talk about later, to get up there. But we've fallen behind now, and I think we can recover from this. But somebody's got to get interested in this besides me. Amazing. So just to give you an example of what I'm talking about on this pricing curve, I talked to Bonnie and Mike about this 3 months, whenever we started thinking about this event here. But I just started tracking the news headlines about what's going on in storage. Take a look at yourself and see what you think for March, February. What's going on this year alone? We're at the 6-month mark right now in storage. Take a look. Revenue from enterprise SSDs dropping 27% quarter over quarter. Does that help anybody? It helps the customer. You killed your vendor. Mission accomplished, mission failed, or what happened here? What happened here is that starts to fuel the VMF. Pessimistic view of near-term storage demand in Asia. Hello, okay, that's one part of the world, but now it's a big part of the world. It's where most of the people in the world live. On down here, SSD prices fallen 15 to 30% since January. SSDs are super cheap right now. You know what that does? When they get cheap, they cut into the disk business. If SSDs were the same or lower than disk, you'd never buy another disk drive. They're much faster, a little bit more reliable. You can argue about the energy usage depending on if you're doing reads or writes, but that's kind of nitpicking. But the overall issue is here that this is coming down on top of us here pretty quick. Look at the one up from the bottom, the flash crash. A flash crash. Unbelievable. Why do you have to give away flash memory when it's the hottest storage technology out there? But that's the mentality. Cut the price until somebody will take it. I grew up in that world. You've lived on this, you've lived in it from the other side of the canal here, so that's the way it goes on this. HDD shipments in the upper right dipped 35% year over year. 34 million HDDs shipped from desktop computers all the way to the hyperscalers. 34 million were shipped in the first quarter of this year. What does that mean? Well, what it means to me is that in 2013, for the whole year, the disk industry shipped 651 million disk drives. Divide by 4 per quarter, that's about 164 million per quarter. We've gone from 164 million disk drives a quarter to 34 here. Now the capacity is bigger, so the total capacity shipped doesn't fall that much. But the number of units, which is how factories base their load on manufacturing, how many units do they build, how many shifts do we work? Dramatic crash. And yet we were talking earlier about how much data in the world is created and where's it all going? And we're building less product, but we're shipping more capacity because the devices get bigger, and that's the key piece of this. We, if any of you remember at Storage Tech, we had this wonderful circular library called the Powderhorn. And when it came out, it had 6,000 cartridges in it, total capacity of 1.2 terabytes. Today's biggest tape cartridge is 20 terabytes. You could put 16 silos on one cartridge today. We couldn't fit 16 silos very easily in this room. But that's how much density has changed the game here. A lot of density, fewer units, and nothing said about data performance. Unless you talk solid state, performance doesn't enter the conversation. It's all about dollars per terabyte capacity. And so I'll get off this chart, but you can look at the news items so far this year about what's happened. This is the toughest year in storage since 2001, which was the last year we had a decline like this. This will pass. But the aftermath of the pandemic, supply chain, inflation, killing people, layoffs, everything else here. And there's a whole list of things. You know, the price has just taken a bashing this year in this stuff. Again, you might love that. You might help your budget, but you know, it's short-term thinking for tomorrow's development. So we take a look at that, and I mentioned data protection earlier, because I'm concerned we left the whole archive world out of this. For years, we've talked about the last several years, really, about data protection and, you know, the 3-2-1-1 backup strategy, 3 copies of your data. But this is data on disk, mission-critical data that means something. You're going to back that up. Remember, we're not probably going to back up archives because we never thought about doing that. But in this case, data that means anything, you should have 3 copies of that data. You should have it on 2 different types of media. You should have 1 copy stored somewhere geographically different in case there's a flood, fire, hurricane, terrorist attack. What do we have here? All of those, maybe, I don't know. But anything that can damage this data, you ought to have it somewhere distant. And help me if I'm wrong, but I think your distant location is 90 miles north in Cheyenne, is that right? something like that. So, you've got another location that's far enough out of the danger zone to work on that. One of those copies should be air-gapped, which means there's no electronic connection to the stored data. If there's no electronic connection, you cannot hack that data. Take the tape library. All those cartridges sitting in there, they're not electronically connected until you take one out and either by hand or with a robot stick it in a drive. Now it's hackable. But as long as it's offline, it's there. So the archive strategy for this is a 2-2-1 strategy. You don't need 3 copies of the archive, but the ideal archive data protection strategy would have 2 copies in 2 different locations, and one of those would be air-gapped. However you want to work through that. But those are the options here that people have right now to kind of get around this, because as data gets more valuable, the loss of that data becomes more critical. And sooner or later, this is going to bite and going to hit hard if the data is valuable. Decision to be made there. So one of the other things going on right now in this space is what basically the hyperscalers and a lot of the larger data centers that have multiple locations. And let's look at Amazon. They've got about 60 hyperscale data centers all over the globe. 60 locations spread around the globe. So we had RATE come out. And Mike's done some work on this, with me before, but RATE came out, redundant arrays of independent tape, where you take the file and you stripe blocks around a lot of different cartridges in the same library. But what you do when you got that file spread on that, you mount 3 or 4 cartridges at the same time, whatever the stripe width is, you read them all in parallel, and you just increased your data rate by 3 or 4 times for tape. Now tape, which has a 400 megabyte per second data rate, is looking at doing the same thing on disk at 220 megabytes a second, except the tape data rate's now 4 times bigger because my stripe width. Now I'm 7 or 8 times faster on the data transfer for bulk, large data transfers than disk. Disk can't compete with tape on data transfer. And it gets a lot farther in favor of tape if you use RATE. Oak Ridge is a big user of RATE. The HPCs, you guys, I don't know if you use RATE or not, but it's a big deal for a lot of those people. But that's where it is. It's not a commercial technology very much. Few do, but not a lot. But if you have a lot of data centers in different geographic locations, the next evolution beyond RATE is rail. Redundant arrays of independent libraries. It takes RATE one step farther. It takes your file or your object, breaks them down into chunks, we'll call them blocks in this case, but they're really chunks, and it spreads those around. Block number 1 would go on tape library number 1 in Australia, and block number 2 would go on library number 2 in Boulder, Colorado, and block 3 would go on library number 3 in where? Mumbai, somewhere in the Pacific. Block 4, you back around again. We stripe again back to library number 1. And it keeps going around. Every time you write a block, you create parity. But these use erasure codes, which are intensive to compute the hash codes. So they're stored with erasure codes, much less overhead than RAID on disk. And when something fails, the hash erasure code reconstructs that pretty quick. Not pretty quickly, because that's the challenge. It's not as fast as RAID. But you've got all kind of geographic redundancy here, and you've also got multiple copies of your data. This is what the hyperscalers will use for global data protection. By the way, if you can sync up the bandwidth, which on a global basis is not easy to do, you'll get multiple parallel transfers. What if your file is spread between Australia, South America, and Africa, and you bring them all in at once? That's a lot of bandwidth coordination, but it can be done. So this has got all kind of promise for large-scale people. Sooner or later, whenever you get there, if you get there, you may be there already, this will be something you'll want to look at. But it's brand new for the tape industry. It's called Rail, and I say it's brand new for the tape industry because we looked at it at Storage Tech 30 years ago. Not a chance of working. RATE or Rail. The tape drives did not have a big enough cache. You couldn't synchronize the transfer to get them all to transfer at once. That's all been solved today, 20 years later, because tape has very large tape drive caches. You can sync it all up out of memory, and everybody's transferring in sync. But before, the mechanical movement of tape kind of negated that. So this is a new one to think about. It's coming. It'll take on prominence as we move through the remainder of this decade, and hyperscale continues to dominate so much. I'm going to go back to tape a little bit. I think, Storm, you mentioned epsilon ferrite, but this is kind of the evolution of what's happening in tape. And, growing up I actually, when I worked at Storage Tech, I never worked on tape. I was a solid state disk and a disk guy. Somehow I got into this in a big way in the last 10 years. So, but my genetic code was different, I think, anyway, here we are. But back in those days, tape was metal particle. So if you had data written on metal particle tape and you stored it on a rack for 5, 6, 7 years, everybody kind of went nuts thinking, I can't read it, it'll flake off, the surface will go away, whatever. Why did that happen? Because metal particle tape is not oxidized. As soon as it oxidized, it crumbled and some things would fall off, some wouldn't, but you couldn't be sure if that tape would come back. Well, in 2013, tape went to barium ferrite. And guess what? That media, that level of recording on barium ferrite, much higher density, and it was also already oxidized. So it didn't fall off when you left it on the rack 10 years. And the tape industry, I just did the annual report for the Tape Storage Council. And the tape industry now is a laboratory determined that the media life is up to 50 years for tape. Is that good or bad? Exactly. What if it's 500 years? You know, who cares? Because the underlying drives are going to be so obsolete in 50 years, you're going to need something else. It's like beta tape. You know, the tape's good, but there's nothing to read it anymore because the drives have moved way beyond that. So it lasts a long time. What it means is you don't have to worry about anything flaking off in your lifetime because it's already oxidized. And that's going to take tape up to about 580 terabytes, okay, which is what's been demonstrated by IBM and Fujifilm in the Zurich laboratory. The guy that runs that lab, I've seen him speak a few times. He's the one doing the testing on this. They've demonstrated with the capability of strontium ferrite, which is what's the next phase. They can get up to 580 terabytes in a cartridge package. And then after that, the epsilon ferrite will take them over a terabyte. Or 1,000 terabytes, a petabyte per cartridge. A petabyte cartridge, we'll see in our lifetime here. So this is the evolution of this, and in LTO, which is 90% of the shipments of all tape in the world, that's how this comes out. The LTO roadmap in the past several months has been extended from LTO 8, LTO 10. It's now out through generation 14, LTO 14. And I want you to look carefully at this because I look at this, I'm looking at this as an analyst, what I want to see. And what's happening here is that you notice every one of these things says up to. That's not what they're going to deliver. That's the high water mark. Will they hit it or not? But they bought some room in the development here that we might come in a little short of that. That's observation number one. Observation number two, nothing mentioned about performance. What are my data rates? We're at 400 megabytes per second today on tape. 220 is the high water mark for the fastest disk you can find. Most of them are 160 megs in that range. I need to know that data rate. If I keep increasing capacity and I don't change the data rate, what took me a day to get off of there will take 2 weeks eventually. So we leave that out of the conversation. So as a vendor, I might talk about capacity. As an analyst, I need to know what's going on here. And I'm disappointed I don't know how fast this is, because if you don't improve the data rate, this tape moves from archive way down to the time capsule zone. I can store it there, but take me a week to read it, the first record back. So I'm asking you just think about the overall ecosystem around this. This is great news that the density can keep flying like crazy on tape, and it'll take us well into the next decade. But there's more to the story. So the next question is, from here to where? Where will we be looking 5 and 10 years ahead? Bill, you asked me to talk about the future a little bit when we discuss this. Well, we're going to talk about it a lot. Because if you don't think about your future, you don't have one. So if you look on the current technology stack on the left, here's what we've got up here. We've got at the top of the stack the fastest set of technologies out there, non-volatile memories. We've got SRAM, Flash, 3D Crosspoint, which is pretty well passed away on us here recently, phase change memory, MRAM. DRAM is still volatile, so we cannot count that as a true non-volatile memory. It's not used to store data. DRAM is a workspace for applications. But DRAM is really not part of the storage hierarchy. But anyway, these are the solid state technologies that all exist. They're recording technique. They're based on an electron charge. Charge an electron, that's how we get there. That's what's physically stored on the chip itself. What is the roadmap capability here? There's aggressive development here, a lot of money, a lot of funding. They're not subject to VMF. This place is smoking hot. Future developments, multi-layer 3D stacking. We're at 192 layers on a flash chip right now. By the way, when you stack that many layers on what used to be a single flat layer of technology, that many layers, you have heat dissipation issues. So they have to solve that with a lot of canals up and down the stack to get that out of there, and they do. Flash memory. You write out there a couple times, no problem. You write out there 100,000 times, and the cells wear out and they fatigue. So there's all this other processors in the solid state technology to do house cleaning and determine when a chip starts to fatigue, I'm going to relocate that data somewhere else. If you buy 100 gigabyte flash drive, flash technology, you just got 200 terabytes sent to you because they'll use the other half of that to spare out the existing data and extend the life of it. When all that's gone, then we're going to have to replace it. Who knew? Biggest challenge here is price. And I say that having shown you a chart a few minutes ago of the price, crashing in this space. So that's what's happened in that space. But multi-layer stacking is really good. They need faster garbage collection, maybe a couple of new tiers here. But it is it's faster than ever because the stacking of the layers allows you to connect, and the interconnects are closer together and improves access time for the whole stack. Disk drives. Data stored on a disk as a magnetic field. Read-write head writes the data, it changes the magnetic properties of that bit. It's either on or off. Uses more power to write than it does to read. So the power spec on a disk drive has one for reads and one for writes. So we have a magnetic field here. The performance of disk is very limited, and the capacity growth is slow. Let's take this disk drive. The first disk drive in the world ever built had 50 platters in it. It weighed twice as much as me. It weighed 400 pounds. Unbelievable. It's called the Ramac disk. 50 platters. It went all the way down to 3 platters in a stack. 3.5-inch disk. Now we're up to 10 platters in disk. The disk industry cannot change their areal density very much at all. So to increase capacity, they're adding platters. So that means I add more data, more files, more objects. I got one access arm still to go after this. So that now all that activity has less of a chance of being serviced because the queue depth is building up waiting on that one arm to start doing that. So if you can increase capacity in storage and you don't increase performance, you've created a big access density problem. I'm stunned, again, I'm into this, but I'm stunned at how many customers just don't even think this way. Give me the space, lower my price, and I'm done. I don't like it, but that's the way it is. A lot of things that way. But there we go. So that's what the disk people are doing. And by the way, there's a dual actuator disk out. So let's say I have one disk, 20 terabytes with one arm on it, or I can buy one 20 terabyte disk with 2 actuators on it. And which one of those is faster? Anybody else? So the 2 actuator disk has one actuator that services the lower 10 terabytes and another one the top. So it's like 2 terabyte disks or 120 byte disk. So it's a packaging exercise. If the actuators could all service all the data in there, then that would be different. But if I've got a disk, you cut it in half, one actuator up here for one request, and it's busy, and I get another request for that same upper half, it's got to wait. Well, the whole bottom half is not being serviced. But if they could all service everything, so when you do that, you actually cripple the capacity of a 20 terabyte disk. And I almost fell for this myself, and I said, I got to think this through, but when you get a 2 terabyte or a dual actuator disk, you divide by 2 because it's like 2 single disks at half the capacity. And that's why it's not making much progress in the industry, because it's not doing much right now. People are beginning to understand this whole thing. But disk is trying to struggle. We got 10 platters in a stack now. More platters and take more power to turn it. You got more parts in there, more heads, more arms, more things to fail. The failure rate goes up. The reliability goes down. Is that a good formula? In 2023, when we're living on high availability? Who thinks about this? So we're talking about the other side of the storage game right now, just between us to understand what's really going on in here. Again, I am just amazed that this is not common knowledge, but it is not. So there's a number of things going on in disk, a lot of development. They announced a plan to get to 40 terabytes. I don't know if that thing will be 15 feet tall or not, but it's a big deal out there. And then we move on down to tape. I mentioned tape, strontium ferrite, epsilon ferrite. A lot going on there in the tape industry. The biggest challenge for tape has been access time. That's been addressed by a new feature that came out with LTO9 called Recommended Access Order. It takes all the requests up against a high-capacity tape and reorders them in the priority that would reduce the physical motion of tape, because the tape's recorded in partitions back and forth. If you access tape in the way the requests come in, the tape could just kill you. But this sorts them all out and orders them to minimize the physical movement. IBM's announcement said they had up to 73% reduction in initial access time. That's a big deal in tape. Initial tape access time, say 30 seconds, 60 seconds, and here we go. We can take 70% of that out. And it started with LTO9, so the prior versions don't have that. To me, and I lived to get hammered on access time so many years in my career, this is gigantic. Once again, I'm looking around for somebody to call me and say that's really cool. It's buried in an announcement. Now, any of us can market better than that. I know I can, but man. So the challenges are access time, on and on. With this optical disc, I'm not going to talk about it. It's not a data center technology. It's an entertainment technology. It's in your car. It's in your home. It's not in your data center. And it never will be. And then this summary chart is on tape. Right now, with all these things going on, I mean, we're still looking at tape as the leading candidate here. It's proven, it works, it's got an ecosystem. All these other technologies are having these struggles. So you see the challenge the storage industry is in right now. Big challenge is not enough money to fund. VMF is, if you can forecast the weather, and I'm sure you guys can, you can probably see that we can now forecast a VMF. So I'm going to skip on with that. And here's the new emerging technologies that are on the radar screen. If you look at the left column, the y-axis going up and down, that's what we've got now from top to bottom, solid state up to tape, going across the top, or the emerging technologies, including the new tape format. I just mentioned 580 terabyte tape. The issue there is when will we see it, but it's been demonstrated. And there's several versions to go through. Photonics using fluorescent recording. Optical disc sends an optical beam down to the disc, it reflects back, it diffuses, and it loses reliability. It's 1 in 10 to the 12th for optical disc. A little flutter in your movie, whatever, you don't care. A little flutter in your database coming back, you do care. So we got a real problem there. Optical disc is not going to find a home in the data center, but fluorescent recording sends the beam down, it comes back, and the beam comes back pure. There is no refraction. It's a clean signal back. Reliability is good. Right now, and I'm working with a client in Cleveland, Folio Photonics, and they can write 9 layers on each side of a disk using fluorescent recording. So it's a hybrid version and a much advanced version over the traditional Blu-ray, who's got a roadmap moving at the same pace as a snapping turtle. Across the top, photonics. I just mentioned DNA was pretty hot, getting a lot of publicity, and it's been de-emphasized this year. The leading company doing that laid off their entire marketing team. It's slow coming. How does 8-hour access time sound to you? I need an I/O, and I'll come back tomorrow after lunch and see if I got it. This is deeper archive, even than deep archive. This is way down the line there. Glass media, I saw a demonstration of that at the Library of Congress. Piece of glass in a disc shape, written on there, a whole image, and it writes an entire image at a time rather than bits. So the data rate's a little hard to talk about on there, but it's slow. Holographic storage. The last vestige of holographic storage was in Longmont, Colorado. It ended about 2012, 2013. And it never made it. Holographic storage was essentially where 2 lasers meet, and where they met, it created an interference pattern. That was a bit. Wrote it once, and it changed the reflectivity of that area in the 3D substance that it was used. It was called 3D refraction. Well, guess what? When it was exposed to light, the data went away. That's not very good. So they put them in sealed dark cartridges. But, if you got a little light in there, adios. Even cybercrime can't get rid of data that fast, but it did. And I tell you, and I was, I got to look and work with this a little bit. I couldn't believe it. But the thing about holographic storage is there's been more written about it than there's ever been written on it. Okay, so keep that in mind. So here we go. We've got a few other things off farther, liquid memory, quantum computing, but a little bit out of there. But one thing that is going to happen is lunar recording and terrestrial systems. And you guys were with me. You guys were with me when I mentioned this in Tucson, and some guy in the audience stood up and says, "We're storing data in satellites right now." I looked over during the conference. I said, "You got to be kidding me." Yeah, they're using satellites in space. Temperature, no problem. Cooling, no problem. Bandwidth, big problem. I mean, you got 30 feet on Bluetooth, 300 feet on Wi-Fi. You can go around the world on fiber. You can go around the world on wireless, 5G. But how in the world can you go to the moon? And that data rate's going to be a little bit of a challenge there. So here we go. We're going to close out the last slide of this discussion. We're going to take a look at what lies ahead for us. We just touched the surface here today. We could go on and on, but here we are on the left. We're in the Zettabyte era. We're about eight years into that now. And as we move around this circle in a counterclockwise motion, you'll see that we're here right now. We're in the artificial intelligence era. It has begun in earnest this year. It's big. It's all over the place. It's being used in many different ways. We're going to move around to singularity, which is the next evolution of artificial intelligence. There's pros and cons of this, as we all know, so I'm not going to deal with that. But these are the evolutionary steps that we'll go through with pluses and minuses to work around there. Quantum computing. The center of quantum computing in the United States is Boulder County. Unbelievable. There's more stuff going on here at the University of Colorado than any other single place. This is the heart of it. I'd love to talk more about that. That wasn't our goal today. But lunar computing. The edge of the moon, where the dark and the light area meets for about 50 miles, has about the same temperature as the Earth. And therefore, data centers could be there without any cooling and energy. This is happening. There are people already talking about how are we going to put data up there. Quit tying up acres and miles of land here on Earth that we don't have when we can do this. So this is longer term thinking for sure to go out there. Soon we exit then, in 2040 we exit the Zettabyte era and head right on through Yottabyte, Brownabyte on down the line here. So there you go. This is what lies ahead. We'll probably see in this combination to bring this together a hypercloud that manages this whole thing. It'll be determined, but some of the key components are listed here for this. This is what we have to look forward to. So if you're in the storage business and you want to have a career, it's yours. All right, Storm, I'm done. Thank you.
I was going to ask you to give him a hand, but apparently you guys figured that out all on your own. Anyway, we are going to have a light reception in the Damon Room right after this. And so anyway, feel free to drop on in. Anyway, thank you very much for your time yet again. And
you're welcome.
See you over in the Damon Room.
Okay, if I can find it, I'll be there.